Picture this, a submarine the length of a football field, lurking beneath the ocean waves. But this isn't just any submarine. Hidden inside its massive hull are 3 fully armed bomber aircraft, folded like origami, ready to strike at a moment's notice. This sounds like something out of a James Bond movie, doesn't it? Like Q's latest invention for 007. But here's the shocking truth. This was real, and it was built in 1944. While your parents or grandparents were buying war bonds and following news of D-Day, the Japanese Navy was constructing the most advanced weapon the world had ever seen. A submarine that could surface anywhere on Earth, launch airstrikes, and vanish without a trace. These underwater giants were called the I-400 class, and they were headed for one target, the United States of America. Imagine if Pearl Harbor had been followed by bomber attacks on New York City, Washington DC, or the Golden Gate Bridge. Not from aircraft carriers that could be spotted and sunk, but from submarines that were completely invisible until the moment they struck. For over 70 years, this story remained classified. The US military kept it buried in secret documents. Most World War II documentaries never mention it. History books barely give it a footnote. Why? Because these submarine aircraft carriers came terrifyingly close to succeeding, and because the technology was so advanced that it influenced submarine design for the next 50 years. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets. We're going to reveal how Japan built these underwater monsters, what their mission was, and why the story was hidden from the public for decades. This is history they never taught you in school. This is the weapon that could have changed everything. Let's start with a question. What's the biggest submarine you can imagine? If you've watched movies like The Hunt for Red October or visited a naval museum, you might picture those massive nuclear submarines from the Cold War era, the kind that carried ballistic missiles and could stay underwater for months. Now, imagine someone building a submarine that size in 1944, without computers, without nuclear power, without any of the advanced technology we take for granted today, using only mechanical systems, slide rules for calculations, and the raw determination of engineers who refused to believe something was impossible. That's exactly what Japan did. The I-400 class submarines were engineering marvels that shouldn't have existed. At 400 feet long, that's longer than a Boeing 747 jumbo jet, they were the largest submarines ever built until nuclear missile submarines appeared in the 1960s. Let me give you some perspective. A modern Los Angeles-class attack submarine is 360 feet long. The I-400 was bigger, and it was built 80 years ago. But size was just the beginning. The real innovation was what they put inside. These submarines had something no other submarine in history possessed: a massive cylindrical hangar, 102 feet long and 11 feet in diameter, running along the top of the submarine like a tunnel. Inside this hangar sat 3 Aichi M6A Seiran bomber aircraft. Now you might be thinking, wait, how do you fit an airplane inside a submarine? Excellent question. The Japanese engineers asked themselves the same thing, and their solution was brilliant. The Seiran bombers were specifically designed to fold up. The wings rotated 90 degrees and folded against the fuselage. The horizontal tail fins folded down. The vertical tail fin folded to the side. When completely folded, the aircraft fit perfectly inside the hangar, stacked like sardines in a can. But here's what really sets your mind spinning. The entire process of removing these aircraft from the hangar, unfolding them, mounting their floats, fueling them, arming them with a 500-pound bomb, and launching them via catapult could be completed in less than 30 minutes. 30 minutes? From submarine to airborne bomber. Think about that for a moment. Modern aircraft carriers, with all their sophisticated equipment and hundreds of crew members, need longer than that to prepare and launch a strike mission. These submarines could do it with a crew of 144 men in the middle of the ocean after travelling 20,000 miles without refuelling. The engineering challenges were staggering. Every component had to be waterproof. The hangar had to maintain perfect seal integrity at depths up to 330 feet. The catapult system had to work flawlessly because you only get one shot. If the plane doesn't launch successfully, you're stuck on the surface, vulnerable, with nowhere to hide the aircraft. The Japanese engineers solved each problem with innovative solutions that seem almost magical, even by today's standards. They designed a special catapult that used compressed air and explosive charges to hurl a 4,500-pound aircraft from 0 to 60 miles per hour in just 70 feet. For comparison, the catapults on modern aircraft carriers have about 300 feet to launch aircraft. They created a sophisticated air filtration system that could keep the hangar dry and at exactly the right temperature and humidity to prevent the aircraft from corroding during months at sea. They built a crane system that could lift each aircraft out of the hangar onto the deck in just minutes, even in rough seas. And perhaps most impressively, they designed the submarine's hull with a unique figure 8 cross-section, 2 cylinders side by side, that provided the strength to support the massive hangar on top while maintaining the hydrodynamic efficiency needed to travel at 18 knots on the surface. To put this in perspective, let's compare the I-400 to American submarines of the same era. The US Navy's standard submarine, the Gato class, was 311 feet long, displaced from 1,500 tons, and had a range of about 11,000 miles. It carried 24 torpedoes and had a crew of 80 men. The I-400 was 400 feet long, displaced 6,560 tons, submerged, had a range of 37,500 miles, enough to circle the globe 1.5 times, carried 20 torpedoes plus 3 bomber aircraft, and had a crew of 144. It wasn't just bigger, it was an entirely different class of weapon. But who came up with this wild idea? Who looked at the conventional wisdom of submarine warfare and said, "No, we're going to do something completely different"? The mastermind was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the same strategic genius who planned the Pearl Harbor attack. But unlike the popular image of Japanese military leaders as fanatics, Yamamoto was actually one of the most westernized officers in the Imperial Navy. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He had travelled extensively across the United States, visiting factories, oil refineries, and military installations. He had walked the streets of New York and Washington. He spoke fluent English. And because of all this, Yamamoto understood something that most Japanese military leaders didn't fully grasp. America's industrial capacity was absolutely overwhelming. He knew that Japan couldn't win a prolonged war of attrition. He knew that America could outproduce Japan 10-1 in ships, 20-1 in aircraft, and 100-1 in practically everything else. Japan's only hope, and Yamamoto knew this from the very beginning, was to strike such devastating psychological blows that America would negotiate a peace settlement before its full industrial might could be mobilized. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be that knockout blow. But it wasn't enough. It didn't destroy America's aircraft carriers, and instead of demoralizing the American public, it unified them with a determination Yamamoto had feared all along. So, in January 1942, just 1 month after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto proposed something even more audacious, a weapon that could take the war directly to the American homeland, not just military bases in Hawaii or the Philippines, but New York, Washington, San Francisco, the heart of America. Imagine the psychological impact. Imagine the front page of the New York Times reporting that Japanese bombers had appeared without warning and struck the city, that they came from submarines no one detected, struck their targets, and disappeared back into the ocean before the Coast Guard could respond. It would be Pearl Harbor multiplied by 10. The entire American coastline would become a war zone. Millions of people would live in fear, not knowing when or where the next attack might come. The economic disruption alone, the evacuation of coastal cities, the diversion of military resources, to homeland defence could be enough to tip the scales. And the beauty of the plan, from Yamamoto's perspective, was that America had no defence against it. Radar could detect aircraft, but only after they were already airborne. Sonar could detect submarines, but the Pacific Ocean is vast. Finding a handful of submarines in millions of square miles of water would be like finding needles in a haystack. So Yamamoto presented his vision: 18 submarine aircraft carriers, each capable of striking anywhere in the world. Together, they would form an invisible fleet that could attack America's most vital targets and disappear without a trace. The naval staff were sceptical. The engineering challenges seemed impossible. The costs would be astronomical. And Japan was already stretched thin, building conventional submarines, aircraft carriers, and battleships. But Yamamoto wasn't taking no for an answer. He had the emperor's ear, and he used it. In March 1942, the order was given: begin construction of the Sentoku submarines. Sen meant submarine, and Toku meant special. These would be special submarines indeed. The first keel was laid in January 1943 at the Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan's most advanced shipyard. The project was given the highest priority classification. Workers were sworn to absolute secrecy. Even the submarine's designation, I-400, I-401, I-402, was designed to be misleading, making them sound like standard submarines rather than the revolutionary weapons they truly were. But as construction began, two problems emerged that would ultimately doom Yamamoto's grand vision. First, building these underwater monsters took time, lots of time. Each submarine required over 2 years to construct, using precision manufacturing techniques and specialised materials. While American shipyards were mass-producing Liberty ships and Essex-class carriers using assembly line methods, Japanese shipyards were handcrafting these technological masterpieces one rivet at a time. Second, and far more devastating, Admiral Yamamoto himself wouldn't live to see his dream realised. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted and decrypted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message included his exact flight path, timing, and the type of aircraft he'd be flying in. President Roosevelt personally authorised the mission: shoot down Yamamoto's plane. Long-range P-38 Lightning fighters flew 435 miles over open ocean, timed their arrival perfectly, and ambushed Yamamoto's transport. The admiral, who had conceived of submarine aircraft carriers, who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had understood America better than any other Japanese officer, was killed instantly when his plane crashed into the jungle. With Yamamoto gone, support for the I-400 project wavered. Resources were desperately needed elsewhere. The ambitious plan for 18 submarines was cut to 9, then to 5, and finally to just 3. By the time the first I-400 slid into the water in January 1945, the war had already turned decisively against Japan. American forces were island hopping across the Pacific. The Philippines had been liberated. Iwo Jima was under assault. Japan's surface navy had been decimated at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But the I-400 program continued, because even in desperate times, Japan's military leadership clung to hope that a spectacular attack on America might still change the course of the war. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to receive orders for one final desperate mission, a mission that would be their last chance to use the weapon Yamamoto had dreamed of. The target? The Panama Canal. And the plan was absolutely brilliant. A submarine without aircraft is just an expensive way to hide underwater. The I-400 submarines were revolutionary, but they were only half of the equation. The other half was the Ichi M6A Seiran, possibly the most specialised aircraft ever designed. The name Seiran translates to mountain haze, or storm from a clear sky, a poetic reference to an attack that appears from nowhere. And that's exactly what this aircraft was designed to do: materialise out of the ocean mist, strike its target, and vanish. But creating an aircraft that could fold up inside a submarine, survive months in a saltwater environment, launch from a catapult, carry a heavy bomb load, and still perform as a combat aircraft required solving engineering problems that seem mutually exclusive. Let's start with the most obvious challenge, making an airplane small enough to fit inside a submarine. A standard carrier-based bomber of World War II, like the American SBD Dauntless, had a wingspan of about 41 feet. The I-400's hangar was only 11 feet in diameter. Simple math told you this was impossible, unless you could make the wings fold. Aircraft with folding wings weren't new. American carrier planes had been using them since the 1930s to save space on hangar decks, but those aircraft had wings that folded up vertically, which still left them too wide for a submarine hangar. The Seiran's wings did something different. They rotated 90 degrees backward and folded flat against the fuselage. The horizontal stabilizers folded downward. The vertical tail fin folded to the side. When fully folded, the entire aircraft fit within a cylinder just 11 feet in diameter and 28 feet long. It was like watching an origami master fold a paper crane, except this crane was made of aluminum and could carry 1,800 pounds of explosives. But folding wasn't enough. Every hinge, every locking mechanism, every hydraulic line had to be designed to work perfectly every single time. Because if a wing didn't lock properly during the unfolding process, the aircraft would tear itself apart the moment it tried to fly. The engineers at Aichi Kokuki, Aichi Aircraft Company, spent months designing and testing these mechanisms. They created hydraulic systems that could unfold the wings in less than 5 minutes. They designed positive locking mechanisms that would physically prevent the aircraft from being launched unless everything was properly secured. Then came the waterproofing challenge. Remember, these aircraft would be stored inside a submarine hangar for months at a time. They'd be surrounded by salt air, exposed to temperature variations, subjected to the humidity of the ocean environment. Any moisture getting into the engine, the instruments, or the control systems could be catastrophic. Every panel joint was sealed. Every access door had multiple gaskets. The engine itself was wrapped in a waterproof cover that could be quickly removed before flight. Even the instrument panel was hermetically sealed. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Japanese engineers knew that even with perfect waterproofing, the engine would be cold when it came time to launch. Aircraft engines of that era needed to be warmed up before flight, usually at least 15 minutes of running at idle to get the oil flowing and the cylinders up to operating temperature. But you can't run an aircraft engine for 15 minutes while sitting on the deck of a submarine. The noise would alert every ship and aircraft within miles, and you certainly couldn't wait 15 minutes after surfacing. Every second on the surface was a second of vulnerability. The solution? Preheated oil injection. Before each aircraft was placed on the catapult, crew members would inject hot oil directly into the engine. This brought the engine up to operating temperature almost instantly. When the pilot started the engine, it was already warm and ready for full power. This hot start system was remarkably innovative, and it worked. Pilots reported that the Seiran's engine would fire up and reach full power in less than 2 minutes. Now let's talk about the catapult launch itself, because this was perhaps the most terrifying part of the entire system. Modern aircraft carrier catapults use steam pressure and give pilots about 2 to 3 seconds of acceleration. The Seiran's catapult used compressed air and explosive charges, and the entire launch lasted less than 1 second. Imagine sitting in that cockpit. You're perched on a submarine deck that's rolling in the ocean swells. Below you is nothing but water. In front of you is a 70-foot track ending at the bow of the submarine. You're wearing a special harness because the launch acceleration is so violent that it could snap your spine if you weren't properly secured. The launch officer gives the signal. You advance the throttle to full power. The catapult fires. In 0.8 seconds, you go from 0 to 60 miles per hour. The G-forces slam you back into your seat with 4 times your body weight. The world becomes a blur. The submarine falls away beneath you. And suddenly, you're airborne. Or you're in the water. There is no in-between. Test pilots who flew the Seiran described the catapult launch as like being kicked by a horse. Several pilots suffered cracked ribs during training launches. One pilot fractured his vertebrae. But they kept flying, because this was what the mission required. Once airborne, the Seiran actually performed quite well as an aircraft. It had a top speed of 295 miles per hour, not fast by fighter standards, but respectable for a bomber. It could fly for up to 700 miles with a full bomb load, giving it enough range to strike targets far inland and return to the submarine. The aircraft could carry either one 800-pound bomb or one Type 91 torpedo. The torpedo option was particularly interesting because it meant the Seiran could attack ships as well as land targets. Imagine a submarine launching aircraft to torpedo other ships. It's submarine warfare turned inside out. The cockpit accommodated a pilot and a navigator bombardier. The navigator sat behind the pilot in a slightly raised position, giving him visibility for navigation and a clear view through the bomb sight. But here's something most people don't realise. The Seiran was never intended to return to the submarine. Look at the aircraft's design and you'll notice something missing. Landing gear. The Seiran was a float plane, designed to land on water and taxi back to the submarine, where it would be hoisted aboard by the deck crane. Except there was a problem with this plan. Recovering an aircraft at sea took time, at least 30 minutes per aircraft. That meant the submarine would need to remain surface for over an hour to recover all 3 planes, maintaining a fixed position in hostile waters while completely vulnerable to enemy aircraft and ships. The operational planners quickly realised this was suicide, so they made a decision that tells you everything about the desperation of Japan's situation in 1944. The Seiran would be a one-way aircraft. Pilots would launch, strike their targets, and then ditch the aircraft at sea. If they were lucky and close to land, they might be able to swim to shore. If not, well, that was the price of serving the Emperor. This wasn't officially a suicide mission like the kamikaze attacks, but the survival rate was expected to be nearly 0. The pilots knew this. They accepted it. Training for Seiran pilots began in late 1944 at a secret base on Lake Biwa, Japan's largest lake. The base was so secret that it didn't appear on any maps. Pilots were transported there at night, wearing blindfolds. They signed documents swearing them to secrecy under penalty of death. The training was brutal. Pilots practiced catapult launches until they could do them in their sleep. They practiced navigation over water with no landmarks. They practiced bombing runs at wave-top level to avoid radar detection. They practiced ditching their aircraft and swimming to shore. And they practiced over and over the one skill that would matter most, attacking their target on the first pass, because there would be no second chance. By June 1945, 31 Seiran aircraft had been built. They were distributed among the 3 operational I-400 class submarines and kept in ready condition, waiting for orders. The orders came in July. The target, the Gatun locks of the Panama Canal. The mission was called Operation Hikari, Operation Light, but there was nothing light about it. This would be the longest range submarine operation in history, a 10,000-mile journey to the gateway between America's 2 oceans, with the goal of crippling the canal and cutting the US Navy in half. The Seiran crews were briefed. The I-400 submarines were loaded with fuel, supplies and torpedoes. The aircraft were carefully folded and placed in their hangars. Final preparations were made. Everything was ready. And then, on August 6, 1945, everything changed. A single American B-29 bomber dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The age of the submarine aircraft carrier had ended before it ever really began. But before we get to that ending, we need to understand exactly what Operation Hikari was supposed to accomplish and how close it came to succeeding. Because the plan itself was absolutely brilliant and absolutely terrifying. Let's talk about geography and why the Panama Canal was the single most strategic target Japan could possibly attack. If you look at a map of the United States, you see a country with two coasts separated by 3,000 miles of land. Before the Panama Canal opened in 1914, ships travelling between New York and San Francisco had to sail 13,000 miles around the tip of South America, a journey that took months. The Panama Canal cut that journey to 50 to 100 miles and reduced the travel time to weeks. For the US Navy in World War II, the canal wasn't just convenient, it was absolutely vital. It allowed ships to move quickly between the Atlantic and Pacific theatres. Battleships damaged in the Pacific could steam through the canal for repairs on the East Coast. Aircraft carriers built in Norfolk could reach Pearl Harbor in weeks rather than months. If you destroyed the Panama Canal, you effectively split the US Navy into two separate fleets that couldn't support each other, and that's exactly what Operation Hikari was designed to do. But here's what made the plan so brilliant. The Panama Canal isn't just one structure. It's a complex system of locks, dams, and artificial lakes, stretching 51 miles across the Panamanian Isthmus. You can't just drop bombs randomly and hope to shut it down. The weak point, the Achilles heel of the entire system, is the Gatun locks. The Gatun locks are a series of 3 massive chambers on the Atlantic side of the canal. They lift ships 85 feet from sea level up to Gatun Lake. Each lock chamber is 1,000 feet long, 110 feet wide, with walls 60 feet thick made of concrete and steel. If you destroyed the Gatun locks, water from Gatun Lake would drain into the Atlantic Ocean. The lake would empty. Ships couldn't transit, and repairing the damage would take years, perhaps longer than the war itself would last. This was the target. 3 bombs, 3 aircraft, 1 mission. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. The 3 I-400 submarines, I-400, I-401 and I-402, would travel together in a wolf-pack formation across the Pacific Ocean. They would take a southern route, staying well below the usual shipping lanes to avoid detection. The journey would take approximately 6 weeks. Upon reaching the Caribbean, they would separate. I-400 would position itself off the coast of Panama, near the Atlantic entrance to the canal. The submarine would surface at dawn, when visibility was poor, but there was enough light for navigation. The 3 Seiran bombers would be removed from the hangar, unfolded, armed with 1 to 800-pound bombs, and launched within 30 minutes. The aircraft would fly at wave-top level to avoid radar detection. They would approach the Gatun locks from the jungle side, where anti-aircraft defences were weakest. Each aircraft would target one of the 3 locks. The pilots would use a technique called skip bombing, releasing their bombs at extremely low altitude, so they'd skip across the water like stones before slamming into the lock gates. This technique had been developed by the US Army Air Corps and proved devastatingly effective against hardened targets. After releasing their bombs, the pilots would fly out to sea and ditch their aircraft. The submarine would not attempt recovery. The men would be on their own. Meanwhile, I-401 and I-402 would launch their 6 aircraft against targets of opportunity, likely the Miraflores locks on the Pacific side, or the massive Madden Dam that provided hydroelectric power to the canal zone. The entire operation, from surfacing to bombing to escape, would take less than 2 hours. By the time American forces could respond, the submarines would be submerged and running silent, disappearing into the vastness of the Caribbean Sea. And the Panama Canal, America's strategic lifeline, would be crippled. Let's pause and consider what this would have meant if it had succeeded. First, the immediate military impact. In July 1945, the US Navy was preparing for the invasion of Japan itself, Operation Downfall. The plan called for the largest amphibious assault in history, involving thousands of ships and over 1 million men. Many of those ships and supplies were coming from the Atlantic coast. If the canal was blocked, they'd have to go around South America, adding months to the timeline and creating enormous logistical nightmares. The invasion would have to be postponed, the war would last longer, more people would die. Second, the psychological impact. Americans had been told that their homeland was safe, that the war was being won, that victory was inevitable. A successful attack on the Panama Canal would shatter that confidence. Remember, this would be happening at the same time as the final kamikaze attacks at Okinawa. The American public would see desperate Japanese attacks both in the Pacific and on the American continent. The war would suddenly feel far from over. Third, and perhaps most important, the strategic implications for post-war planning. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August 1945 ended the war before Operation Hikari could be executed. But what if the operation had happened first? What if Japan had demonstrated this capability, submarines with global range, carrying aircraft, able to strike America's most vital infrastructure without warning? Would the decision to drop the atomic bombs have been different? Would the invasion of Japan have been postponed while the Navy hunted for these submarine carriers? Would the entire endgame of World War II have played out differently? We'll never know, because the mission was never completed, but it came much closer to reality than most people realise. Let me walk you through the actual timeline. July 14th, 1945, the 3 I-400 submarines departed from Ominato Naval Base in northern Japan. Aboard were the submarine's regular crews, plus the Seiran pilots and ground crews. Each submarine carried 3 fully armed Seiran bombers in their hangars. The submarines travelled on the surface when possible, diving only when aircraft were spotted or radio intercepts suggested enemy ships nearby. They maintained radio silence, communicating with each other only through underwater sound signals. July 23, 1945, the submarine group crossed the international date line and entered the Central Pacific. They were now 2,000 miles from Japan, heading southeast toward the equator. August 1st, 1945, the submarines reached their first waypoint, near the Marshall Islands. They were maintaining schedule. The Seiran aircraft were checked and rechecked. Everything was functioning perfectly. August 4th, 1945. While the submarines were submerged during daylight hours, the crews noticed an unusual amount of American radio traffic. Something was happening, but they couldn't tell what. They maintained gun course and speed. August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m. Japan time, the atomic bomb exploded over Hiroshima. The submarine crews didn't know about this yet. They were underwater and maintaining radio silence. August 9th, 1945, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Still underwater and silent, the submarine crews continued toward their target, unaware that the world had changed forever. August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement was broadcast across Japan. This broadcast was transmitted on all frequencies, intended to reach every Japanese military unit around the world. At 6 o'clock p.m. Tokyo time, the submarines surfaced for their regular radio check. They received the broadcast. The war was over. The submarine commanders faced an impossible decision. The Emperor had ordered surrender, but they were 4,000 miles from Japan, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, commanding what were arguably Japan's most advanced weapons. Some crew members argued for continuing the mission. We're already this far, they reasoned. We can strike the Panama Canal and disappear. We can show the Americans that Japan will never truly surrender. Others argued that the Emperor's word was absolute. To disobey would be to betray everything they had sworn to uphold. The submarine commanders conferred via radio. After hours of discussion, they made their decision. They would obey the Emperor's command to surrender. But they would not surrender their submarines to the Americans. On August the 16th, the crews gathered on the decks of their submarines. The Seiran aircraft were brought up from the hangars, one by one. The pilots said goodbye to the machines they would never fly in combat. Then, with ceremonial deliberation, each aircraft was pushed overboard and sent to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Torpedoes were fired into the water to ensure the aircraft were destroyed. Classified documents were burned. Codebooks were thrown overboard in weighted bags. The submarines then set course for Japan to surrender as ordered. But the story doesn't end there. Because the Americans were waiting for them, and what they found aboard these submarines would influence naval warfare for the next 50 years. August 28, 1945, Sagami Bay, Japan. American naval officers stood on the deck of the destroyer USS Blue, watching as 3 massive submarines surfaced and approached under white flags. The war had been over for 2 weeks, but this was the first time any American had seen an I-400 class submarine. Commander J.S. McCain Jr., father of the famous senator, was among the officers present. Years later, he would describe his first sight of the I-400 as like watching a science fiction movie become real. It just kept rising, he recalled, and rising. We thought it would never end. When it finally levelled out, the thing was as long as a light cruiser. We couldn't believe the Japanese had built something like this without our intelligence knowing about it. The submarines carried skeletal crews, just enough men to operate them for the journey. The rest had been left at the last Japanese port. The commanders had wisely decided that bringing hundreds of potentially hostile sailors into an American-controlled harbour might end badly. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Kusaka, captain of the I-401, was the senior officer. He stood on his submarine's deck as American sailors swarmed aboard, examining everything with a mixture of awe and professional curiosity. The Americans knew these were special submarines. Intelligence intercepts had mentioned Sentoku boats, but nothing had prepared them for what they found. The massive hangar, the catapult system, the sophisticated navigation equipment, the enormous fuel tanks that gave the submarines global range. Every detail spoke of advanced engineering and strategic thinking, but something was missing: the aircraft. "Where are your planes?" an American intelligence officer demanded. Commander Kusaka stared straight ahead. "Destroyed, as ordered by the Emperor." "When?" "After the surrender broadcast. We followed proper protocol." "Where exactly?" "In the Pacific Ocean. I don't recall the precise coordinates." The American officer didn't believe him. Submarine commanders always knew their exact position, but there was nothing to be gained by pressing the issue. The aircraft were gone, and that was that, or so everyone thought. What happened next is one of the strangest chapters in post-war naval history. The 3 I-400 submarines were taken to the Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan's premier naval facility, which was now under American control. Teams of engineers, intelligence officers, and submarine specialists descended on the boats like archaeologists examining a pharaoh's tomb. Everything was photographed. Everything was measured. Everything was documented. The submarines were then sailed to Pearl Harbor for more detailed examination. The journey took 3 weeks, with American skeleton crews learning to operate these massive machines. At Pearl Harbor, the submarines became the hottest tourist attraction on the base. Every admiral, every captain, every engineer wanted to see these marvels of technology. There was even talk of keeping one as a permanent museum ship. But then, something unusual happened. In late September 1945, the Soviet Union made an official request through diplomatic channels. They wanted to inspect the I-400 submarines. As wartime allies, they argued, they had a right to examine captured enemy technology. The American response was immediate and unequivocal: no. The Soviets pressed harder. They reminded the Americans of the Yalta agreements. They pointed out that they had allowed American observers to examine captured German submarines. They suggested that refusing their request would damage the alliance. The Americans still said no. In October 1945, Soviet naval attachés in Washington, D.C. became more insistent. Behind closed doors, they made it clear, "We will send observers to Pearl Harbor, whether you like it or not." And that's when the United States Navy made a decision that seemed inexplicable at the time. On October 15, 1945, less than 2 months after their capture, orders came from Washington: destroy the I-400 submarines immediately. Navy personnel at Pearl Harbor were shocked. These were priceless pieces of technology. They represented years of Japanese engineering innovation. American submarine designers were still studying them, learning from them. But orders were orders. On November 4, 1945, the 3 I-400 submarines were towed out to deep water off Pearl Harbor. Explosive charges were placed throughout their hulls. At 2:00 p.m, the charges were detonated. The submarines that could have changed World War II sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, taking their secrets with them. Or did they? Here's where the story gets really interesting. For decades, historians assumed the submarines were destroyed completely. The official Navy records said they sank in deep water off Oahu, with no further details provided. But in 2005, a researcher at the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory was examining sonar data from submarine surveys when he noticed something unusual: a large contact on the ocean floor about 5 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor at a depth of 200-300 feet. The contact was the right size for an I-400 submarine. In August 2013, the laboratory launched an expedition using deep water submersibles to investigate. What they found was extraordinary: the intact wreck of the I-401 sitting upright on the ocean floor as if it had simply been parked there. The submarine was remarkably well preserved. The hangar doors were still closed. The catapult was still in place. Even the deck crane looked operational. But here's what fascinated the researchers most. The hull showed evidence of very precise demolition. The explosive charges had been placed to sink the submarine quickly without destroying it, almost as if someone wanted to preserve it intact on the ocean floor. "It was like they wanted to hide it rather than destroy it," said Terry Kirby, the expedition leader. They sank it in a location that was close enough to Pearl Harbor to be convenient, but deep enough that casual divers couldn't reach it. Why? What was so important about these submarines that the Navy would rather sink them than let Soviet observers see them? The answer lies in what American engineers discovered during those 6 weeks of examination. The I-400's propulsion system was more efficient than anything in the American fleet. Its battery design gave it longer underwater endurance. Its snorkel system allowed diesel engines to run while submerged, a feature American submarines wouldn't adopt for another 5 years. But most importantly, the entire concept of the submarine aircraft carrier opened up new strategic possibilities. American military planners in 1945 were already thinking about the next war, the war against the Soviet Union that everyone knew was coming, and they realised that submarine-launched aircraft could deliver atomic bombs. Think about that for a moment. An atomic bomb loaded onto a submarine-launched aircraft. The submarine could position itself off any coast in the world, launch its nuclear strike, and disappear before anyone knew where the attack came from. It was the ultimate doomsday weapon. The Soviets were thinking the same thing. That's why they were so desperate to examine the I-400 submarines. They wanted to build their own. By sinking the submarines, the Americans accomplished 2 goals. They prevented the Soviets from gaining the technology, and they bought themselves time to develop their own submarine-launched strategic weapons. The irony is that neither nation ever built submarine aircraft carriers. The technology that made the I-400 obsolete was sitting in a laboratory in New Mexico, even as the submarines were being sunk. By 1946, the world didn't need submarines that carried aircraft. It needed submarines that carried missiles. But the influence of the I-400 design lived on. The giant nuclear ballistic missile submarines of the Cold War, the Soviet Typhoon class, the American Ohio class, owe their existence to the concept proven by Japan's submarine aircraft carriers that you could build a submarine large enough to carry and launch strategic weapons. The I-400 was the father of every missile submarine that followed. And speaking of influence and legacy, there's one more chapter to this story that needs to be told. What happened to the Seiran aircraft that were thrown overboard before the submarines surrendered? Because the Americans found one, and what it taught them changed the future of naval aviation. Remember how Commander Kusaka claimed the Seiran aircraft were destroyed after the surrender? He wasn't entirely lying, but he wasn't telling the whole truth either. Yes, the operational aircraft were pushed overboard and sunk, but the Japanese had been smart enough to keep spare parts, prototype aircraft, and test models hidden at various locations throughout Japan. When American occupation forces began sweeping through Japanese military facilities in September 1945, they made a remarkable discovery at the Aichi Aircraft Company plant in Nagoya. Sitting in a corner of the factory, covered with camouflage netting and surrounded by debris as if it had been forgotten, was a complete Seiran bomber. The aircraft was intact. The wings could still fold. The engine turned over. It even had its original blue-grey camouflage paint scheme. Intelligence officers immediately recognised what they had found. This was the aircraft that flew from submarines. This was the delivery system for the Panama Canal attack. This was a piece of technology that existed nowhere else in the world. The aircraft was carefully disassembled, crated, and shipped to Naval Air Station Alameda in California for study. For the next 15 years, that Seiran sat in storage at Alameda, occasionally brought out for engineering studies but largely forgotten. Engineers would come, take measurements, make drawings, and leave. The aircraft became a curiosity, interesting, but not relevant to the jet age that was dawning. In 1962, the Seiran was transferred to the Smithsonian Institution's storage facility in Suitland, Maryland. It was packed into a warehouse with hundreds of other World War II aircraft, waiting for the day when the Smithsonian might have enough space to display it. That day came in 1989. The National Air and Space Museum was planning a major renovation of its World War II collection. Someone remembered the Seiran and suggested it might make an interesting display piece. When conservators examined the aircraft after 27 years in storage, they found it in terrible condition. The airframe was corroded. Fabric covering had rotted away. The folding mechanisms were seized. The engine was a block of rust. But the Smithsonian decided to restore it. Not just clean it up, fully restore it to its original condition. The restoration took over 10 years and cost more than $3 million. Every piece had to be carefully conserved or replicated. The folding wings had to be made functional again. The engine had to be completely rebuilt. Japanese engineers were brought in as consultants. Some of them had actually worked on Seiran aircraft during the war. Now in their 70s and 80s, they were thrilled to see this piece of their youth being brought back to life. One of these consultants was Toshio Ikeda, who had been a young engineer at Aichi in 1944. As he watched Smithsonian conservators work on the wing folding mechanism, tears ran down his face. "We thought this had all been lost," he said through a translator. "We thought no one would ever know what we had accomplished." He spent hours with the conservators, explaining details that existed nowhere in the surviving documentation. How the hydraulic system worked, why certain panels were arranged in a specific way, the tricks that ground crews used to unfold the aircraft quickly. Speed was everything, he explained. The submarine was most vulnerable when it was on the surface with the hangar open. We had to be able to get those aircraft out and launched in minimum time. Every second counted. He demonstrated how the ground crew would open the hangar doors, extend the crane, lift out the first aircraft, unfold the wings, install the floats, fuel the aircraft, arm it, and position it on the catapult, all in less than 10 minutes per aircraft. Americans think of Japanese technology as being precise but slow, he said. But we were fast, very fast. We had to be. The restored Seiran went on display at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center near Washington, D.C. in 2000. It's the only Seiran in existence anywhere in the world. If you visit it today, you can see the remarkable engineering up close. You can see how the wings fold and lock. You can see the reinforced structure needed to withstand catapult launches. You can see the weapons bay that held the 1,800-pound bomb. What you can't see, what doesn't appear in any of the display placards, is how this aircraft influenced American naval aviation for decades after the war. Let me explain. When American engineers examined the Seiran in 1945-46, they were particularly interested in three aspects of its design. First, the folding wing mechanism. The Seiran's wings folded more compactly than any American carrier aircraft. Engineers studied the hydraulic systems, the locking mechanisms, the structural reinforcements. This knowledge influenced the design of American carrier aircraft throughout the 1950s and 60s. Second, the catapult launch system. The Seiran could launch from a 70-foot track using compressed air and explosive charges. American aircraft carriers at the time used steam catapults that required much longer tracks. The Seiran proved that shorter, more powerful catapults were possible. This directly influenced the development of the C-11 steam catapult, installed on American carriers in the 1950s. Third, and most important, the entire concept of storing folded aircraft in a compact space for extended periods. This might not sound revolutionary, but think about it. Aircraft carriers store planes below deck and bring them up to the flight deck when needed. But what if you could store aircraft in an even more compact form? What if you could pack twice as many aircraft into the same hangar space? This thinking influenced the design of American aircraft throughout the Cold War. The F-14 Phantom, the A-6 Intruder, the F-14 Tomcat all had wings designed to fold into very compact configurations, influenced by lessons learned from the Seiran. But there's an even more direct legacy. In the early 1950s, the WWII Navy began developing a concept called the Regulus missile, essentially a cruise missile that could be launched from submarines. The missile would be stored in a hangar on the submarine's deck, brought out, unfolded and launched. Sound familiar? The Regulus program directly borrowed ideas from the I-400 Seiran system. The submarine USS Tunney was modified with a hangar and catapult system, remarkably similar to the I-400's design. In 1953, Tunney successfully launched a Regulus missile while submerged. The Navy had reinvented the submarine aircraft carrier, just with missiles instead of manned aircraft. The Regulus program was eventually replaced by ballistic missiles launched from vertical tubes, the Polaris system that defined submarine warfare for the next 40 years. But the bridge between the I-400 and the Polaris submarine was the Regulus, and the Regulus was directly inspired by the Japanese design. There's one more aircraft story that needs to be told, and it's perhaps the strangest of all. In 2009, deep-sea explorers searching for a crashed B-29 bomber off the coast of Okinawa made an unexpected discovery: the wreck of a Seiran bomber sitting upright on the ocean floor at 250 feet depth. The aircraft was remarkably intact. The wings were still folded. The bomb was still in the weapons bay. It looked as if it had been carefully lowered to the bottom rather than crashed. Carbon dating of organic materials found in the cockpit suggested the aircraft had been underwater since August 1945. This was one of the Seiran bombers that Commander Kusaka claimed to have destroyed after the surrender announcement. And technically he was correct. Pushing it overboard counted as destruction. But why was it so intact? Why hadn't it broken apart on impact with the water? The answer became clear when divers examined the bomb bay. The bomb was still armed with its safety pins in place, but the aircraft's fuel tanks were empty. The Japanese crews hadn't just thrown the aircraft overboard, they had carefully prepared them, removing fuel to reduce fire risk, ensuring the bombs wouldn't detonate on impact, even positioning the aircraft so they would sink cleanly. They were preserving them. Why? Perhaps they believed Japan would rise again. Perhaps they thought that someday these aircraft would be recovered and studied. Perhaps they simply couldn't bear to completely destroy the machines they had worked so hard to create. Whatever the reason, those aircraft are still down there, scattered across the Pacific floor, waiting to be discovered. As of 2024, at least 5 Seiran wrecks have been located by deep-sea surveys. None have been raised. The cost would be astronomical, and the saltwater damage after 8 decades underwater has made them extremely fragile. But they exist as time capsules, frozen at the moment of Japan's surrender, representing a technology that came so close to changing history, and they remind us of something important. Innovation doesn't die. The ideas that went into the I-400 and the Seiran didn't disappear when the submarines were sunk and the aircraft pushed overboard. Those ideas evolved. They influenced new designs. They sparked new innovations. The I-400 became the ballistic missile submarine. The Seiran became the cruise missile. The concept of surprise attack from beneath the waves became the foundation of nuclear deterrence. In a very real sense, the Cold War was fought using strategies pioneered by those Japanese submarine aircraft carriers. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about legacy and influence, we need to understand what the American military learned when they examined these submarines and why they kept it secret for so long. November 1945, Naval Intelligence Headquarters, Washington, D.C. A classified report landed on the desk of Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The report was marked Top Secret, Eyes Only, and bore the title Technical Analysis, Japanese Submarine Aircraft Carriers, Sentoku Class. What followed were 247 pages of engineering analysis, photographs, diagrams, and strategic assessment. The report had been compiled by teams of naval engineers, submarine specialists, and intelligence analysts who had spent 3 months examining every detail of the captured I-400 submarines. Admiral Nimitz read through the entire report in one sitting. When he finished, he picked up his phone and called a meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The report's conclusions were startling and deeply troubling. Let me walk you through some of the key findings, based on documents that were finally declassified in the 1990s. Finding number 1, range and capability. The I-400 submarines had a range of 37,500 nautical miles at 14 knots, enough to circle the globe 1.5 times without refuelling. This gave them the ability to strike literally anywhere on Earth. But here's what shocked American analysts. The submarines achieved this range while carrying 3 aircraft, 20 torpedoes, food for 144 men for 3 months, and sufficient spare parts to conduct repairs at sea. American submarines of comparable size had roughly half that range and carried no aircraft. The fuel efficiency of the I-400's diesel engines was superior to anything in the US fleet. The report included a calculation that still gives historians chills. If Japan had possessed 10 I-400 class submarines at the start of the war instead of 3 at the end, they could have maintained continuous operations against American coastal cities from December 41 until present. Think about that. Continuous submarine aircraft carrier attacks on American cities for 4 years. Finding number 2, stealth and detection. The I-400 submarines were designed with acoustical quieting technology that was years ahead of American submarine design. The electric motors that powered underwater movement were mounted on rubber isolation mounts to reduce noise transmission through the hull. The propellers were designed with a special blade shape that reduced cavitation, the bubbles that create noise and make submarines detectable by sonar. American submarine sonar operators were brought in to test whether they could detect a submerged I-400 at various distances. The results were sobering. At 2,000 yards, detection rate 40% at 1,000 yards, detection rate 65% at 500 yards, detection rate 85%. For comparison, American submarines of the time were detected 90% of the time at 2,000 yards. The report concluded, these submarines could approach to within 1 mile of the American coast with minimal risk of detection. They could surface, launch aircraft and submerge again within 30 minutes. By the time coastal defence forces responded, the submarines would be underwater and running silent, making them nearly impossible to locate and destroy. Finding number 3, construction quality. This was perhaps the most surprising finding. American engineers expected Japanese construction to be inferior. Propaganda throughout the war had portrayed Japanese manufacturing as shoddy and primitive. Instead, they found submarines built to tolerances that exceeded American standards. The welds were cleaner. The pipe fittings were more precise. The electrical systems were better insulated. Even the crew accommodations, while Spartan, were more thoughtfully designed than comparable American submarines. One engineer wrote in his assessment, "If I didn't know this submarine was built by Japan, I would have assumed it came from a German shipyard. The quality of workmanship is extraordinary." This finding forced a wholesale re-evaluation of Japanese industrial capability. Clearly, the wartime propaganda had been wrong. Japan was capable of producing technology that matched or exceeded American standards. Finding number 4, innovative features. The I-400 submarines incorporated numerous innovative features that American submarines lacked. A snorkel system that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged. Advanced battery technology that provided longer underwater endurance. A desalination system that converted seawater to drinking water. Sophisticated navigation equipment, including gyro compasses and radio direction finders. An air conditioning system that kept the submarine's interior comfortable even in tropical waters. A washer-dryer system for crew laundry. American submarines didn't have this until the 1960s. Each of these features was analysed in detail. Engineering drawings were made, prototypes were built and tested. The US Navy began incorporating these innovations into American submarine design almost immediately. Finding number 5, the strategic threat. This was the section that worried Admiral Nimitz most. The report's strategic analysis section assessed what would have happened if Operation Hikari had succeeded in destroying the Panama Canal. The conclusions were grim. Loss of the Panama Canal would have extended the Pacific War by an estimated 12 to 18 months. Invasion of the Japanese home islands, currently planned for November 1945, would need to be postponed until mid-1946 at earliest. American casualties would increase by an estimated 200 to 300,000 personnel. Japanese civilian casualties would increase proportionally. But more troubling was the next section, titled Future Threat Assessment. The analysts looked at what submarine aircraft carrier technology could become in the hands of a hostile power. Their scenarios included submarines carrying atomic weapons. This was written just months after Hiroshima. Submarines carrying biological weapons. Submarines carrying long-range missiles. Coordinated attacks by multiple submarine carriers operating as a fleet. One particularly prescient paragraph stated, "The concept of submarine-launched strategic weapons represents the future of naval warfare. Any nation possessing such technology will have the ability to threaten any coastal city in the world with minimal warning and no effective defence." This was written in November 1945. The first American submarine-launched ballistic missile wouldn't be tested until 1960, 15 years later. But the analysts who examined the I-400 understood exactly where this technology was heading. After reading this report, Admiral Nimitz made a decision that would shape American submarine development for decades. All information about the I-400 submarines would be classified at the highest level. No information would be shared with allies, including Great Britain. The submarines themselves would be destroyed to prevent foreign powers from examining them, and American submarine designers would begin immediately incorporating I-400 innovations into new designs. But this created a problem. How do you keep something secret that hundreds of people already know about? The answer was a combination of classification, misdirection, and selective memory. First, everyone who had worked with or examined the I-400 submarines was required to sign new secrecy agreements. Violation would result in court-martial and imprisonment. This included not just military personnel, but also civilian contractors and engineers. Second, the official naval history of World War II, published in 1947, mentioned the I-400 submarines in exactly one paragraph. The description was vague and downplayed their capabilities. Most people reading it would assume they were just large conventional submarines. Third, photographs of the submarines were classified. The few images that were released showed them from angles that made them look smaller and less sophisticated than they actually were. Fourth, technical details were removed from all public documents. The hangar system, the catapult, the range calculations, the quieting technology, all of it disappeared from official records. The strategy worked. For over 40 years, the I-400 submarines remained obscure footnotes in naval history. Even military historians had only vague knowledge of their capabilities. It wasn't until the 1990s, when the Cold War ended and documents began to be declassified, that the full story finally emerged. But here's the really interesting part. While the American public didn't know about the I-400 submarines, American submarine designers never forgot. Every major advancement in American submarine technology from 1945 to 1990 can be traced back to lessons learned from the I-400. The USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear submarine, had a snorkel system based on the I-400's design. The USS George Washington, the first ballistic missile submarine, used missile tubes positioned similarly to the I-400's aircraft hangar. The Los Angeles-class attack submarines, built in the 1970s and 80s, incorporated noise reduction technology pioneered by the I-400. Even the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent, owe their basic layout to concepts proven by the Japanese submarine aircraft carriers. The secret reports written in 1945 became the blueprint for American submarine supremacy in the Cold War. And the Soviets? They desperately tried to learn what the Americans had discovered. Soviet intelligence agencies spent years trying to obtain information about the I-400 submarines. They never succeeded. By the time Soviet spies finally pieced together the basic facts about the I-400 design, American submarine technology had already moved far beyond it. The Soviets built their own giant submarines, the Typhoon class, largest submarines ever built. But they were essentially trying to recreate what the Japanese had accomplished 40 years earlier. The irony is, and it is, that if the Americans had shared the I-400 technology with the Soviets in 1945, as the Soviets requested, the Cold War submarine race might have turned out very differently. Instead, by keeping it secret, the Americans maintained a technological advantage that lasted for decades. Let's step back from the technology and strategy for a moment. Because behind all these engineering marvels and strategic plans were human beings. Young men who believed they were serving their country, who trained for missions they knew might kill them, who said goodbye to families they might never see again. Their stories deserve to be told. Lieutenant Toshio Kusaka, commander of the I-401, was 32 years old when the war ended. He had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy at age 18, graduated at the top of his class from the Naval Academy, and specialised in submarine warfare. Kusaka was selected to command the I-401 because he had proven himself in combat. He had already sunk 4 Allied merchant ships and damaged a destroyer. He was exactly the kind of aggressive, skilled commander that the I-400 program needed. But Kusaka was also a thinking man. His personal diary, which was confiscated by American forces and later declassified, reveals a commander who understood the desperation of Japan's situation. An entry from July 1945 reads, We depart tomorrow for the Panama mission. The crew is in good spirits, but I wonder if any of us truly believe we will return. The Americans control the seas. Their radar sees everything. Their aircraft are everywhere. We are sailing into certain death, and we all know it. Another entry, dated August the 10th. We received word of the Emperor's surrender broadcast. Some of the officers want to continue the mission regardless. They say we owe it to our nation to strike one last blow. But I look at the young sailors, boys really, some of them, and I think, what right do I have to order them to die for a war that's already lost? Kusaka made the decision to obey the Emperor's command and surrender. Some of his officers never forgave him for it. One wrote him a letter years later, calling him a coward. But Kusaka lived to see his children grow up. He became a merchant ship captain after the war and sailed for another 30 years. He died in 1984 at age 71, having never spoken publicly about his wartime service. His final diary entry, written the day before he surrendered his submarine, simply says, "I chose life. History will judge whether I was right." Then there were the Seiran pilots. Lieutenant Kazuo Takahashi was one of the 31 pilots trained to fly the Seiran bombers. He was 23 years old, a skilled pilot who had scored high marks in every training exercise. His letter to his parents, written before departing on the Panama Canal mission, was discovered among his belongings when he died, of natural causes, in 2003. The letter was never sent. The mission was cancelled before he could mail it. The letter reveals a young man torn between duty and the realisation that his mission was essentially suicide. Dear Mother and Father, by the time you read this, I will have completed my mission. I want you to know that I am not afraid. I am honoured to serve the Emperor and to strike a blow against the enemy. But I confess that I am sad. I wanted to return home. I wanted to see your faces again. I wanted to meet the girl you selected for me to marry. I wanted to have children and grow old. These wants are selfish, I know. My duty is clear, but please understand that I am still your son, and I will carry your faces with me until the end. Please be proud of what I am doing. Please remember me, your loving son, Kazuo. Takahashi survived the war. When the surrender was announced, he was aboard the I-400 preparing for the mission. The Seiran aircraft were destroyed, and he returned to Japan as a prisoner of the Americans, though he was released within months. He never flew again. He became a schoolteacher and spent 40 years teaching children about mathematics and science. He never mentioned his wartime service to his students. In an interview given shortly before his death, Takahashi said, "People ask me if I regret that I never got to complete my mission. The truth is, I'm grateful every day that I survived. War makes young men feel invincible, makes them believe that dying for your country is the greatest honour. But living for your country, building it, teaching its children, helping it grow, that is the real honour. I'm glad I got to do that instead." Not all the stories have happy endings. Chief Petty Officer Makoto Watanabe was the lead mechanic responsible for maintaining the Seiran aircraft aboard the I-401. At 41, he was one of the oldest enlisted men on the boat. Watanabe had worked for Ichi Aircraft Company before the war. He knew every bolt, every wire, every hydraulic line in the Seiran bombers. He could fold and unfold the wings blindfolded. He could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. When the order came to destroy the aircraft after the surrender, Watanabe volunteered to be the one to push them overboard. "These are my children," he told Commander Kusaka. "I should be the one to say goodbye." Watanabe personally supervised the destruction of each aircraft. He drained the fuel. He removed the bombs. He said a prayer over each one before pushing it into the ocean. A crew member who witnessed this later wrote, "Chief Watanabe stood at the rail watching the third aircraft sink beneath the waves. Tears were streaming down his face. He stood there for over an hour, just staring at the water. When he finally came below, he looked like he had aged 10 years. Watanabe returned to Japan and tried to find work in aviation, but the American occupation forces had dismantled Japan's aircraft industry. The factories were closed, the engineers scattered. He eventually found work as a janitor at a school in Osaka. He swept floors and cleaned bathrooms for 20 years. He never mentioned that he had once been one of Japan's most skilled aircraft mechanics. When he died in 1967, at age 63, his obituary listed his occupation as school custodian. Only his family knew what he had really done during the war. And then there are the Americans who captured and examined these submarines, men whose lives were changed by what they discovered. Commander David L. MacDonald was a submarine officer assigned to the technical examination team at Pearl Harbor. He spent 3 months studying every aspect of the I-400 submarines. MacDonald was so impressed by what he found that he spent the rest of his career advocating for better American submarine technology. He pushed for larger submarines, longer range, better crew accommodations, advanced noise reduction. He rose through the ranks, eventually becoming Chief of Naval Operations, the highest position in the US Navy, in 1963. And throughout his tenure, he championed submarine development based on lessons learned from the I-400. In a speech given in 1965, still partially classified at the time, MacDonald said, "In 1945, I examined a Japanese submarine that showed me the future of naval warfare. Everything we've built since then, our nuclear submarines, our missile boats, our strategic deterrent, exists because of what I learned from that enemy submarine. The Japanese lost the war, but in a very real sense, their ideas won the peace." There were others too, engineers who studied the I-400's engines and went on to design better American diesels, metallurgists who analysed the hull steel and improved American manufacturing, hydrodynamicists who studied the hull shape and created more efficient submarine designs. Each of them was sworn to secrecy. Each of them kept that oath, sometimes for decades. They could never fully explain to their families, their friends, or even their colleagues what they had worked on or why it mattered. One engineer, whose name remains classified even today, wrote in his personal papers, now held at the Naval Historical Center, "I spent my entire career building on what the Japanese taught us. But I could never say that out loud. I could never give them credit. So instead, I just did the work and hoped that someday when the classified veil was finally lifted, people would understand." But perhaps the most poignant human story involves the Seiran aircraft sitting in the Smithsonian. When the aircraft was being restored in the 1990s, the museum sent letters to Japan seeking former Aichi Aircraft Company employees who might be willing to consult on the restoration. One of the respondents was an elderly woman named Yoko Yamada. She had worked as a secretary at Aichi during the war. "I wasn't important," she told the museum staff through a translator. "I just typed reports and filed paperwork. But I remember the Seiran project. It was so secret that we weren't allowed to talk about it, even among ourselves." Then she said something that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing. "I remember the pilots, they would come to the office sometimes to review their mission briefings. They were so young, and they knew, we all knew, that they weren't coming back. But they would smile and joke with us. Anyway, they wanted us to think they were brave." She paused, and tears filled her eyes. "I typed so many letters to their families. After the war, after we knew the mission had been cancelled, I typed letters saying, 'Your son survived. He's coming home.' It was the only good news I got to type during that entire war." The Smithsonian staff asked if she would like to see the restored aircraft when it went on display. "No," she said quietly. "I'm glad it still exists. I'm glad people will learn about it. But for me, that aircraft represents all the young men who almost died in it. I'd rather remember them as they were, alive and smiling, than see the machine that nearly killed them." These human stories remind us that technology, no matter how impressive, is ultimately wielded by people. People with hopes and fears, people with families waiting at home, people who sometimes survive and sometimes don't. The I-400 submarines and their Seiran aircraft were engineering marvels, but they were also instruments of war, designed to kill and potentially to end the lives of those who operated them. When we talk about the submarine that could have changed World War II, we can't forget that changing the war would have meant more death, more destruction, more grieving families. Perhaps it's fitting that these submarines never got to complete their mission. Perhaps the world is better for it. Let's fast forward to 1960. The Cold War is at its height. The United States and Soviet Union are locked in an arms race that threatens to destroy the world. And the centerpiece of that arms race is a weapon that owes its existence to those Japanese submarine aircraft carriers sitting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The USS George Washington, America's first ballistic missile submarine, was commissioned on December 30th, 1959. She carried 16 Polaris missiles, each with a nuclear warhead. She could strike targets in the Soviet Union from beneath the ocean, unseen and virtually unstoppable. The Washington represented a revolution in warfare, the ability to deliver nuclear weapons from a mobile, invisible platform that the enemy couldn't target or destroy. But if you look at the technical specifications of the George Washington, you'll notice something interesting. Her displacement was 6,700 tons submerged, almost exactly the same as the I-400. This wasn't a coincidence. When American submarine designers began working on ballistic missile submarines in the mid-1950s, they faced exactly the same challenge that Japanese engineers had faced in 1942. How do you build a submarine large enough to carry strategic weapons while maintaining the stealth and efficiency needed to survive in hostile waters? The design files for the George Washington, now declassified, include multiple references to lessons learned from Sentoku examination. The American engineers studied the I-400's hull design, its internal layout, its ballast tank configuration, even its crew accommodation arrangements. They didn't copy the I-400. American technology had advanced far beyond that, but they learned from it. The vertical missile tubes on the George Washington were positioned in the centre of the submarine, running along its spine, exactly where the I-400's aircraft hangar had been positioned. The reasoning was identical. Putting the heavy weapons in the centre of the boat maintained balance and stability. The George Washington's snorkel system, which allowed diesel generators to run while submerged, was a direct descendant of the system pioneered by the I-400. Even the way the submarine's interior was organised, separating the missile compartment from crew spaces, mirrored the I-400's design philosophy. But the connection between Japanese submarine aircraft carriers and American missile submarines goes deeper than just technical specifications. Remember Admiral Yamamoto's vision? A fleet of submarines that could strike anywhere in the world without warning, delivering devastating attacks before the enemy could respond. That vision became America's nuclear deterrence strategy. The entire concept of mutually assured destruction that kept the peace during the Cold War was based on having submarines at sea, invisible, capable of launching nuclear missiles at any moment. If the Soviet Union attacked America, these submarines would survive and retaliate, destroying the Soviet Union in return. It was the same strategy Yamamoto had envisioned, just with nuclear missiles instead of bomber aircraft. The Soviets understood this too, and they desperately wanted to match America's submarine capabilities. In the early 1960s, Soviet intelligence agencies intensified their efforts to obtain information about American submarine technology. But they were also looking backward, trying to learn what the Americans had discovered from examining the I-400 submarines. Soviet engineers knew that the Americans had sunk the I-400s somewhere near Pearl Harbor. In 1963, a Soviet research vessel spent 3 months conducting oceanographic surveys in Hawaiian waters. They were actually searching for the sunken submarines with sonar. They never found them. The US Navy had been very careful about where they sank the I-400s, choosing locations deep enough and remote enough to make recovery impossible with 1960s technology. Frustrated, the Soviets decided to simply build the biggest submarine they could design and hope they got it right. The result was the Typhoon-class ballistic missile submarine, at 48,000 tons submerged, the largest submarine ever built. The first Typhoon was launched in 1980, 35 years after the I-400 was sunk. But here's the fascinating part. When American intelligence first got detailed photographs of the Typhoon's interior layout, they were shocked by the similarities to the I-400. The Typhoon had two separate pressure hulls side by side, the same figure-8 cross-section that the I-400 had pioneered. The missile tubes were positioned between the two hulls. The crew quarters were in one hull, the control room and weapons systems in the other. How did the Soviets arrive at this design? Had they somehow obtained I-400 technical data? Or had they simply solved the same engineering problems the same way? We still don't know for certain, but submarine historians believe the Soviets probably got their hands on I-400 technical documents that the Japanese had hidden before surrender, documents that American forces never found. Whatever the source, the legacy is clear. The I-400's design philosophy influenced submarine development on both sides of the Cold War. But the legacy extends beyond just submarine design. The I-400 program taught military planners something crucial about the nature of strategic weapons. Surprise and mobility are more important than raw firepower. A battleship might have bigger guns, but a submarine with aircraft or missiles can appear anywhere, anytime, without warning. That uncertainty, that fear of attack from an unknown direction, is more strategically valuable than any amount of armour or artillery. This insight shaped Cold War strategy in profound ways. The nuclear triad, bombers, land-based missiles, and submarine-launched missiles, was designed on the principle that diversity of delivery systems prevents the enemy from developing a single effective defence. If you can't predict where the attack will come from, you can't stop it. That's pure Yamamoto. That's the I-400 philosophy writ large across global strategy. And it worked. The Cold War stayed cold, largely because both superpowers had submarine-based nuclear deterrence that guaranteed mutual destruction. No one could win, so no one tried. In a very real sense, the I-400 submarines helped to prevent World War III. But there's another legacy that's equally important, though less often discussed. The I-400 program proved that innovative thinking could overcome material disadvantages. Japan in 1944 was losing the war. American industrial output dwarfed Japanese production. American technology was generally more advanced. American resources were virtually unlimited compared to Japan's shrinking empire. By every rational measure, Japan should have been building smaller, simpler submarines to maximise production numbers. Instead, they built the most technologically advanced submarines in the world. They didn't build many, only 3 were completed, but those 3 submarines represented a leap forward in thinking that influenced naval architecture for the next half-century. This lesson wasn't lost on military planners. In the 1950s and 60s, when the Soviet Union appeared to be ahead in the space race, when Sputnik shocked America, when it seemed like the US might be falling behind, military and political leaders remembered the I-400. They remembered that innovative design and bold thinking could overcome numerical disadvantages. They remembered that one revolutionary weapon could be worth 100 conventional ones. This thinking influenced everything from the Apollo program to stealth aircraft development to the internet itself, which began as a military project designed to create a communication system that could survive nuclear war. The I-400's legacy is woven throughout the technological development of the late 20th century. Today, if you visit submarine museums around the world, you'll find plaques and displays about the I-400 class, but most visitors walk past them without understanding their significance. They see a curious footnote. Japanese submarine aircraft carriers, only 3 built, never used in combat. What they don't see is that these submarines changed the world. They changed how submarines were designed. They changed strategic military thinking. They changed the course of the Cold War. And they did it without ever firing a shot in anger. Sometimes the weapons that change history are the ones that never got used. The I-400 submarines sit on the ocean floor, slowly corroding away. The Seiran aircraft are scattered across the Pacific in pieces. The engineers who designed them are long dead. The crews who sailed them have nearly all passed away. But their ideas live on. Every ballistic missile submarine that patrols the world's oceans today carries a little bit of the I-400 in its DNA. Every cruise missile fired from a submarine uses concepts pioneered by those Japanese engineers. Every naval planner studying how to project power from beneath the waves stands on foundations laid by Admiral Yamamoto's vision. The I-400 may have been a failure in terms of its wartime mission, but as an idea, as a proof of concept, it was one of the most successful weapons ever built. And that's perhaps the most important lesson of all. Sometimes losing the battle means winning the future. Japan lost World War II, but Japanese submarine technology won the Cold War. March 2005. The research vessel, Kaimikai Okanaloa, sailed out of Honolulu Harbour, carrying some of the most advanced deep-sea exploration equipment in the world. The Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory was conducting a survey of the ocean floor southwest of Oahu, mapping previously uncharted areas at depths exceeding 2,000 feet. It was supposed to be a routine scientific mission. It turned into a historic discovery. On March 17, 2005, the remotely operated vehicle, ROV, descended to 2,300 feet, its lights cutting through the eternal darkness of the deep Pacific. The camera fed live video back to the research ship. And then, suddenly, there it was. A massive submarine, sitting upright on the ocean floor, as if it had been carefully parked there, its hull still remarkably intact after 60 years underwater. The researchers immediately recognised what they had found. The size alone told them this wasn't just any submarine, and when the ROV manoeuvred around to the deck, they saw the massive cylindrical hangar running along the spine of the vessel. They had found one of the I-400 submarines. But here's what makes this discovery so remarkable. The submarine wasn't destroyed. Despite the US Navy's orders to blow it up in 1945, the I-400 had been sunk relatively intact. The hull showed blast damage, holes where explosive charges had been placed. But these were surgical demolitions, designed to flood specific compartments and sink the submarine quickly. They hadn't scattered the hull into pieces like a conventional scuttling would have. Why? What had the Navy been thinking when they sank these submarines? Documents declassified in 2006, following the discovery of the wreck, finally provided the answer. The Navy had been deliberately preserving the submarines while appearing to destroy them. Here's what really happened in November 1945. Admiral Nimitz received orders from Washington to destroy the I-400 submarines before Soviet observers could examine them. But Nimitz was also aware that these submarines represented valuable technology that America might want to study further in the future. So he ordered a compromise: sink the submarines in a way that looked like complete destruction but actually preserved them intact on the ocean floor. The demolition charges were placed to flood the submarines quickly, but not to break up the hulls. The sinking locations were carefully chosen, deep enough that 1940s diving technology couldn't reach them, but not so deep that future technology couldn't recover them if needed. The Navy even made detailed charts of where each submarine was sunk, though these charts were immediately classified top secret. In essence, Nimitz had created a time capsule, preserving the I-400 technology at the bottom of the ocean, where it would remain hidden until American technology advanced enough to retrieve it safely. Except that by the time American technology caught up, nobody needed to retrieve it anymore. The technology had already been copied, improved, and superseded. The 2005 discovery sparked a renewed interest in the I-400 program. Suddenly, historians and researchers who had largely forgotten about these submarines wanted to know more. In 2013, the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory launched a major expedition to thoroughly document the discovered submarine, which had been identified as the I-401 based on markings visible on the hull. Using advanced ROV technology, researchers created detailed 3D maps of the wreck. They photographed every visible detail. They even carefully opened some external hatches to peer inside, without disturbing the interior or removing any artifacts. The wreck is legally protected as a war grave. What they found inside was astonishing. The submarine's interior was remarkably well preserved. The salt water at that depth is cold and dark, with very little oxygen, conditions that actually slow deterioration. Brass fittings still gleamed, painted surfaces were still visible, even some paper documents in waterproof containers were still legible. One researcher described it as like opening a window into 1945. But the most extraordinary discovery came when the ROV examined the hangar section. The hangar doors were closed, and when researchers analysed the sonar imaging carefully, they detected something inside the hangar, something large. The team spent days debating what to do. Opening the hangar would require physically cutting through the hull, something they were reluctant to do given the wreck's status as a war grave and historical artefact. Finally, they decided to use non-invasive ground-penetrating sonar to see inside the hangar without opening it. What the sonar revealed made international headlines. There was an aircraft inside the hangar. Somehow, against all odds, one of the Seiran bombers had not been destroyed. When the I-401's crew dumped their aircraft overboard in August 1945, they had apparently missed one. Perhaps it was already secured in the hangar for storage, or perhaps it was deliberately left there. For the first time since 1945, researchers were looking at a Seiran bomber in its natural environment, folded up inside the submarine hangar where it was designed to be carried. The discovery immediately raised questions. Should they try to recover it? Could it be raised without destroying it? What could it teach us that the restored Smithsonian Seiran couldn't? As of 2024, those questions remain unanswered. The aircraft is still inside the sunken submarine. International maritime law, combined with Japanese government objections to disturbing a war grave, has prevented any recovery attempts. But the knowledge that the aircraft is there has sparked ongoing discussions about deep-sea preservation, historical archaeology, and how we handle underwater cultural heritage. Meanwhile, other discoveries were being made. In 2009, as we mentioned earlier, a Seiran wreck was found off Okinawa. Then another was located near the Palau Islands in 2015. A third was found in 2018 in deep water east of the Philippines. Each discovery has added pieces to the puzzle of what happened to these aircraft after the surrender. The most recent discovery came in 2023 when a deep-sea mining survey accidentally located what appears to be another I-400 class submarine in waters between Hawaii and California, over 1,500 miles from where the submarines were supposedly sunk. This discovery has reignited old conspiracy theories about the I-400 submarines. Did all three submarines actually surrender? Or did one make a break for it, trying to complete its mission despite the Emperor's order to surrender? The submarine found in 2023 is at a depth of 4,200 feet, too deep for current ROV technology to examine thoroughly. But even the sonar images show something puzzling. The submarine appears to be moving when it sank. Its bow is pointing west, toward the American coast, and the hull is angled downward as if it was diving when something catastrophic happened. One theory is that this submarine was attempting to reach the California coast when it was detected and destroyed by American anti-submarine forces who didn't yet know the war was over. Another theory suggests the crew scuttled it themselves, choosing to die rather than surrender. A third theory, the one most historians consider most likely, is that the submarine suffered mechanical failure and sank accidentally during the journey back to Japan. We may never know for certain. The depth puts it beyond current recovery capabilities, and there's no plan to mount an expedition to examine it more closely. But these discoveries have done something important. They've brought the I-400 story back into public consciousness. Books have been written, documentaries have been made, museums have created new exhibits, and people are finally learning about these remarkable submarines that came so close to changing history. There's also been a fascinating development in Japan. For decades, the Japanese government barely acknowledged the I-400 program. It was an embarrassing reminder of wartime desperation, a symbol of failed military strategy. But in recent years, Japanese attitude has shifted. The I-400 is now seen as a source of engineering pride, evidence that Japanese technology was, in some ways, ahead of its time. In 2019, a museum dedicated to the I-400 submarines opened in Kure, Japan, the city where they were built. The museum includes a full-scale mock-up of a section of the I-400's hull, complete with the aircraft hangar. Visitors can see how the Seiran bombers were stored and how the crew operated. The museum has become surprisingly popular, attracting not just history enthusiasts, but also engineering students who want to study the innovative designs. One of the museum's exhibits includes interviews with the last surviving crew members of the I-400 submarines. As of 2024, only 3 are still alive, all over 100 years old. Their testimonies provide a poignant reminder of the human dimension of this story. "We were so proud of our submarine," one veteran recalled. "We knew we were sailing on the most advanced submarine in the world. We believed we could change the course of the war, and then suddenly it was over. All that effort, all that innovation, and we never fired a shot." Another veteran offered a different perspective. "I'm glad we never completed our mission. If we had destroyed the Panama Canal, how many more people would have died before the war ended? Sometimes failing is a kind of success." These modern revelations and discoveries have fundamentally changed how historians view the I-400 program. Older histories dismissed the submarines as a desperate last gasp of a dying empire. Too little, too late, ultimately irrelevant to the war's outcome. Modern historians see them differently, as revolutionary weapons that influenced naval development for decades, as examples of innovative thinking under pressure, and as symbols of how close the Pacific War came to taking a very different turn. If the I-400 submarines had been completed just 6 months earlier, if they had been deployed before Allied air superiority was established, if their mission had succeeded, the what-ifs of history are always tempting but ultimately unprovable. What we can prove is that these submarines represented a quantum leap in naval technology, that they influenced submarine design for the next half-century, and that they demonstrated capabilities that seemed almost magical, even by today's standards. And now, thanks to deep-sea discoveries and declassified documents, we can finally tell the complete story, a story that remained hidden for over 70 years. The I-400 submarines have finally emerged from the shadows of history, taking their rightful place as one of World War II's most remarkable technological achievements. So, what does an 80-year-old submarine program have to teach us today? More than you might think. In 2019, the United States Navy announced a new submarine program called the Columbia-class, the replacement for the aging Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. The Columbia-class submarines will carry nuclear missiles and serve as America's strategic deterrent for the next 50 years. When the preliminary designs were released, submarine historians immediately noticed something familiar. The Columbia-class submarines incorporate design features that trace their lineage directly back to the I-400, the modular construction system that allows the submarines to be built faster. That's a descendant of the I-400's construction method. The internal layout that separates weapon systems from crew quarters, based on principles established by the I-400. Even some of the noise reduction technology has roots in innovations pioneered by those Japanese engineers 80 years ago. But the lessons of the I-400 program go far beyond submarine design. Lesson 1. Innovation beats numbers. Japan in 1944 couldn't compete with American industrial output. They couldn't build submarines fast enough to replace their losses. They were losing the war of attrition, so instead of trying to build more submarines, they built better ones. 3 I-400 submarines represented more strategic capability than 50 conventional submarines. This lesson resonates today, especially for militaries facing potential adversaries with larger forces. You don't need to match the enemy tank for tank or ship for ship if you can develop technology that gives you a decisive advantage. Modern examples include stealth aircraft, cyber warfare capabilities, and precision-guided munitions, all areas where quality matters more than quantity. Lesson 2. Think asymmetrically. The I-400 program succeeded by ignoring conventional wisdom about what submarines should do. Submarines were supposed to hunt ships and avoid detection. They weren't supposed to carry aircraft. They weren't supposed to project power onto land. They weren't supposed to be strategic weapons. The I-400 broke all these rules. It was asymmetric warfare at its finest, attacking the enemy in ways they didn't expect and couldn't easily defend against. Today's military planners still study this approach. How do you defeat a stronger adversary? You don't fight them on their terms. You find creative ways to exploit their weaknesses. China's development of anti-ship ballistic missiles is a modern example, finding an asymmetric way to threaten American aircraft carriers without building a comparable carrier fleet. Lesson 3. Secrecy has value. The reason the I-400 program almost succeeded was secrecy. American intelligence knew Japan was building large submarines, but they didn't know about the aircraft capability until after the war. If the Allies had known earlier, they would have developed countermeasures, perhaps better, anti-submarine patrols off the American coast, or modified harbour defences at the Panama Canal. Secrecy gave Japan a potential advantage that numbers alone could never provide. Modern military programs still rely heavily on classification and secrecy. The B-2 stealth bomber program remained classified for over a decade before its existence was publicly revealed. Cyber warfare capabilities are deliberately kept secret to prevent adversaries from developing defences. The I-400 demonstrated that sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy doesn't know exists. Lesson 4. Preservation matters. Remember how Admiral Nimitz ordered the I-400 submarines sunk in a way that preserved them? That decision turned out to be remarkably far-sighted. The technology couldn't be recovered with 1945 equipment, but Nimitz understood that future technology might make recovery possible. And indeed, 60 years later, researchers were able to examine the intact submarines and learn from them. This principle applies beyond military technology. How we preserve knowledge, how we archive information, how we maintain historical artifacts. These decisions have implications that extend far into the future. The Seiran aircraft sitting in the Smithsonian is now the only complete example in existence. If that one aircraft hadn't been saved, if the restoration hadn't been funded, an entire chapter of aviation history would exist only in documents and photographs. Lesson 5. Failure can be success. The I-400 program failed in its immediate objective. The submarines never completed their mission. They never struck the Panama Canal. They never proved their worth in combat, but their influence extended far beyond their operational lifespan. They proved that submarine aircraft carriers were possible. They demonstrated design principles that informed submarine development for decades. They showed that innovative thinking could overcome material disadvantages. In business, in science, in engineering, we often focus too much on immediate success and not enough on long-term influence. The I-400 reminds us that impact and success aren't always the same thing. Lesson 6. Technology evolves, but principles endure. The I-400 submarines were designed to carry aircraft. Modern submarines carry missiles. The technology has changed completely, but the underlying principle that submarines can project power beyond just torpedoing ships remains valid. Today's guided missile submarines can strike targets hundreds of miles inland. They can launch drones. They can deploy special operations forces. They can tap undersea communications cables. The specific capabilities have evolved, but the strategic concept pioneered by the I-400 endures. This pattern repeats throughout technological history. The telegraph is obsolete, but communication networks are more important than ever. Steam engines are museum pieces, but the principle of converting heat to mechanical work remains central to power generation. The I-400 teaches us to look past specific technologies and understand the underlying principles that make them valuable. Lesson 7. Sometimes the best outcome is non-use. The I-400 submarines were never used in combat, their aircraft never dropped bombs on American targets, the Panama Canal was never attacked, and the world is better for it. If the I-400s had completed their mission, the war would have lasted longer. More people would have died. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan might have been just the beginning of nuclear weapon use, rather than the end. This resonates today with discussions about nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, and other powerful technologies. Sometimes the best outcome is that the capability exists, but is never employed. Nuclear submarines patrol the world's oceans today, carrying weapons that could destroy civilization. But they haven't used those weapons, and hopefully never will. Their value lies in deterrence, in being capable of action, but choosing restraint. The I-400 program inadvertently contributed to this philosophy of strategic deterrence that has helped to prevent major wars for 80 years. In July 2024, the US Navy held a ceremony at Pearl Harbor to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the I-400 submarines. Japanese naval officers were invited as guests of honor. The ceremony included a wreath laying at sea above the location where the I-401 rests on the ocean floor. American and Japanese sailors stood side by side, honoring the innovation and sacrifice represented by those submarines. One Japanese officer, speaking at the ceremony, offered this reflection. 80 years ago, our nations were enemies. The I-400 submarines were built to strike at America's heart. Today, we stand as allies, our navies working together to maintain peace and security. The submarines failed in their wartime mission, but they succeeded in something more important. They proved that innovation and determination can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. They showed that even in desperate times, human beings are capable of remarkable achievements. And they reminded us that enemies can become friends, that weapons of war can lead to tools of peace, and that sometimes the most important victories are the battles we choose not to fight. The I-400 submarines rest on the Pacific floor, monuments to innovation, determination, and the complex nature of technological progress. They were built to change history through destruction. Instead, they changed history through inspiration, influencing submarine design, strategic thinking, and naval technology for generations. They were the secret weapons that stayed secret for 70 years. They were the aircraft carriers that never launched their aircraft in anger. They were the revolution that came too late to matter in their own war, but just in time to shape the next one. And now, finally, their story has been told. From the drawing boards of 1942 to the museum halls of 2024, from the depths of the Pacific to the pages of declassified reports, the I-400 submarines have completed their final mission, securing their place in history. Not as the weapon that changed World War II, but as the idea that changed everything that came after.